go to the graveyard and let the dead people speak, so to speak. But it turned out that that was a wonderful laboratory of talking about Quaker values and Quaker history, the sociology of Quakerism in the South. For example, that graveyard, I know a number of you have been over there, is, no pun intended, a living example of the sociology of Quakers in the South. You start off in the middle, there are no gravestones. Quakers didn't allow gravestones for many years. It was a vague, worldly thing. There's the story of George Fox, one of the founders of Quakerism. When he died in 1691, he's buried in Bunhill Fields, the nonconformist graveyard outside the gates of London. No stone at all. An admirer later on came in and put a little stone at his grave and etched GF in it. And a better Quaker came on a sledgehammer and smashed that thing to smithereens because it was such a pain and idolatrous thing. Well, that's true of that center part of the graveyard for decades until late 1700s, early 1800s. You begin to see a few very plain stones with initials on them. Later on, you were allowed to have your name and your birth and death date. Later on, you're allowed a few other little expressions. They still got to be plain. Then it comes the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Methodist revivals came through here, and lots of Quakers got saved, sanctified, and bound for glory. And meetings changed in their style, and pretty soon you start seeing Protestant gravestones and even have statues in that graveyard now. And you see that concentric representation of the sociology of Quakerism there. But most importantly, we found wonderful examples of Quaker values and testimony, the spices, the integrity, simplicity, equality, peace, represented by the people there. And so those lives simply spoke, even in the grave. Then we started doing tours for, figured, why keep this little hidden jewel just for the students? And we started offering these to the public. And bit by bit they grew until now our Memorial Day tour and our Halloween tour tracked about 100 people at a time. My wife has had to buy a portable microphone system for me, for the masses. Then we offered a series at the Shepherd Center. I know some of you took that on this. And it just grew, and people kept asking, is any of this written down? Well, I hesitate to write anything down because then people can check up on my facts. But it wasn't written down, and so when I retired from Guilford 4 years ago, I decided that would be one of the projects that should be easy enough to take on. And I simply went over to the graveyard with a pen and pad of paper and sat at each grave and just wrote down what came to me or what rose from the dead. Then did some research and expanding on that, and just put together kind of I'm old enough to say, mimeographed collection of these stories, and shared those with the Shepherd Center group. Gertrude was in that class, and she said, you're leaving some things out, Max. She's a lifetime member of the New Garden Meeting and knows a lot of the folk there. By the way, I didn't realize we're buried there, so she offered to add several essays and sort of expanded from the initial ones to about 46. The kind of trajectory of the stories in there, if you've read them, are kind of intentional. Part of it, again, is growing out of, I had an intention of what I wanted that graveyard to teach people. And one of the things I wanted to teach was the consistency of how those lives spoke to some of the key issues that we all wrestle with. Peace, simplicity, integrity, civil rights, human rights, war, all that kind of stuff. And look at the straight line from people who dealt with the Revolutionary War battles that were fought on that space and how they reacted to that, on through the Civil War, on through the wars of the 20th century, right up until the present. And the examples of how people dealt with that The straight line from the first conductor we know of on the Underground Railroad in North Carolina, buried there, Vestal Coffin. 200 years ago, this is the bicentennial of that. This is kind of part of our observances. Straight through to how Quakers dealt with segregation, with integration, with the battles for civil rights in the 1950s and 60s. And so I hope those stories speak to that consistency, that integrity of how Quaker lives speak. And it's not just Quakers in there. Z. Holler's in there, one of our fine champions of civil rights in our community. That's another one. I didn't realize this Presbyterian was buried. He was probably predestined to be buried there. But Gertrude knew that he was there. Vance Havner. How do you know Vance Havner? Part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. People always ask, what do you have to do to be buried in a Quaker cemetery? I said, they got to be dead. But he got to be in there as a Baptist because his wife was a Quaker. And there's that kind of connection. She was dry cleaned, but then she got washed. She became a Baptist with Vance. But there are people like that. And there's baseball and football and basketball, and there's a recipe for persimmon pudding, too. So something for everyone. Well, enough of all that stuff. I want to read a couple selections to give an example of what I was talking about that straight line from issues that folk wrestled with 200 years ago to issues more recently. And the first one, if I can find it here, it relates to something that's actually commemorated 2 blocks that way. If you draw a straight line from the Benjamin Benson neighborhood, how many of you know there's a Benjamin Benson neighborhood in Greensboro? It's just on the other side of A&T in Bennett, and you'll soon realize why he's an important name. But there's a marker, an historical marker on February 1 Plaza to Benjamin Benson. And you draw a straight line from the Benjamin Benson neighborhood and John Demery Road to that marker on down Friendly to Vestal Coffin's grave, and you've got a history of the Underground Railroad, the manumission societies, and the battle for civil rights in our community. So the first one I want to read is about George Howland Swain, 1768 to 1852. George H. Swain, a physician in the New Garden community, was born in Nantucket and migrated with the large contingent of islanders who settled in North Carolina in the 1770s. A staunch abolitionist, he was one of the few friends who nonetheless decided to stay in the community, as thousands of others left the slave culture of the South for free states. There were about 20,000 Quakers in the South. A little aside here, this is how I always taught my classes. Never a straight line, except for in the book, supposedly. There were about 20,000 Quakers in the South around 1800. By the end of the Civil War, there were fewer than 2,000 adult Quakers in the South because of their opposition to slavery in the entire South. Georgia and South Carolina were completely denuded of Quakers. Not that Quakers ever went nude, except for the early Quakers who had natives to sign. But they all went north. Virginia Yearly Meeting was laid down in 1844 because they all went north. Both sides of my family left the South in the 1820s, 1840s. Again, they're involved in stuff like this. Anti-slavery work, Underground Railroad work, educating blacks when it was against the law. So they eventually were pretty much hounded out. But George Howland Swain stayed. Swain had a role in one of the first known occasions of an African-American person's using the United States legal system to gain his freedom. In 1817, a free African-American named Benjamin Benson was kidnapped in Delaware and sold to a Greensboro businessman named John Thompson, not the basketball coach, and earlier John Thompson. Benson filed a suit in the Guilford County Superior Court to regain his freedom. 3 members of the New Garden Quaker abolitionist community, Vestal Coffin, who 2 years later was the first conductor on the Underground Railroad in North Carolina, Enoch Macy, of those Macy's, the Macy's department store was begun by Roland Hussey Macy, another Quaker from Nantucket, and George Swain, learned of the case and gave it their support. Thompson then sold Benson to a person in Georgia, and the three Quakers pursued the case, convincing a judge to order Benson back to Guilford County, where in 1820 he won his suit. One of the first known instances of a black person using the court system in America. It happened right here. But this was not the only time Swain was involved in such a case. Later, a free African American named Stephen was kidnapped while driving a flock of sheep from Philadelphia to Baltimore and sold into slavery in Virginia. This was pretty common. A lot of the Quaker work on the Underground Railroad was actually addressing free blacks who were kidnapped and sold back into slavery. Because more Quakers felt an ease of conscience of doing that because it wasn't illegal. Quakers had a hesitancy to break the law, even when the laws were inhumane. Get back to that. Levi Coffin Sr., the father of the Levi Coffin who became known as the president of the Underground Railroad, learned of Stephen's plight and contacted his former employer, a Philadelphia Quaker, in an effort to free him. Hugh Lloyd came to Greensboro from Philadelphia by stagecoach, and New Garden Friends meeting appointed Henry Macy and George Swain to go with Lloyd to seek Stephen's freedom. They traveled to Georgia, where the kidnapped man had been taken, found him, and after another protracted legal case, secured his freedom, and Stephen then returned to Philadelphia. I try to imagine, this is, early 1800s. It's not easy to go to Georgia even now. You get hung up on the I-285 in traffic. But imagine taking that kind of effort and expense that it took. But that was the kind of commitment these people had. Swain went on to become the president of Greensboro's auxiliary of the American Colonization Society, an organization that sought to address the problem of slavery by securing the freedom of enslaved persons and settling them in the Caribbean and Africa. Swain would accompany the former slaves to ships on the North Carolina coast and supervise their safe transport to liberty. On one occasion in the mid-1820s, as he attempted to assure acceptable